Well, good evening and welcome to our work session tonight that is related to our discussion of the Chandler's Citizen Exploratory Bond Committee. I noticed that all of our council members, but Councilmember Wong are in presence. Do we have any update on Councilmember Wong? All right. Thank you so much. At this point, we have one discussion item for tonight's work session, discussion and council discretion regarding the structure, policy direction, and calendar for Citizens Exploratory Bond Committee. And at this point, I'd like to turn this over to our city manager.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Appreciate the opportunity, thank you, Don, to have the work session to talk about a need for bond appropriation and a bond election, and your willingness to look at a bond exploratory committee to take a look at these for the city, because it's highly important. This evening or this afternoon, we're going to talk about a number of things, and the first of which, and if you'll move that forward, Dawn, on the, thank you. We're going to talk about the current bond authorization and what is still remaining in our current bond authorization from the election that took place back in 2007. Review of other funding resources that we have. Review of the potential project impacts if we do not have bond authorization. Looking at the structure, as you mentioned, Mayor, for the exploratory committee, the bond committee process and overview. Look for any direction from Mayor and Council as we move into putting the committees together and kicking that off. And then review of the calendar, and then look for any questions that you may have. Again, Mayor and Council, it is highly important for our community and for economic development purposes that we have the ability to continue our infrastructure investments for water, wastewater, public safety, parks, and all of the things that are associated with our bond and the need for that. And so with that, I'm going to let Dawn kick this off with a discussion on where we've been and where we are currently with our bond authorization. Dawn.
Thank you, City Manager. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Hi.
Hi.
I'm sitting so close. The first part of this presentation is to just talk about bonds and what they're used for, why we issue bonds. And they're a very important funding source in the City of Chandler's capital plan. Without them, our ability to add new capital or maintain existing capital would be extremely limited. Bonds can be used to fund land acquisitions, capital construction, large equipment purchases, and other items. Usually these are assets with higher costs and longer useful lives. There are many benefits to selling bonds. Bonds allow us to construct needs in the community immediately, to position ourselves for new residential and commercial growth, or address an immediate need like the recent lighted ball fields that were recently completed. Infrastructure is very expensive. For example, a typical wastewater plant is around $200 million. The ability to save cash that quickly isn't feasible. Therefore, bonds are an important option, which allow us to finance assets over time, usually in less years than the asset is actually used. Bonds can be paid with our secondary property taxes, user fees from our water and wastewater enterprise funds, impact fees, or highway user funds, to name a few. As long as they are consistent revenue streams. Through analysis and planning, we can project growth in assessed values or customer bases, in the case of user fees, to determine the amount of revenue available to support the principal and interest on the bonds, thereby keeping tax rates and user fees the same or planning for minimal changes to support the bonds. Issuing debt is healthy with proper debt management. Chandler's history of financial sustainability has provided a record of strong debt management and solid financial planning that has allowed us to achieve a AAA bond rating. A AAA bond rating is like an individual having an 850 credit report score, giving them borrowing power at very low interest rates, since they're viewed as being a low risk to the lender. Chandler's AAA rating allows us to receive very low interest rates, making borrowing a great decision when weighing inflation, investment earnings, and the benefits of having the infrastructure built now rather than waiting until there's enough cash to fund it. Also, as a municipality, our bonds can be tax exempt, another benefit. Although it does add extra reporting for staff, the city has policies in place to ensure we adhere to these additional reporting requirements. In order for the city to sell bonds, the voters must approve how much we can sell ahead of time.
Thank you, Mayor. So Dawn, we talk a lot about AAA bond rating. What does that mean? And what does that save us? What does that cost us? What's the impact about that with that? I mean, if I had to go AA bond rating, what's the delta? What's going to do to our finances?
Through the mayor, Councilmember Orlando, the AAA bond rating is actually it's an independent rating, just like a credit report is an independent rating of your financial stability. And it really measures your level of risk. If a borrower, which our bonds are actually in great demand, the City of Chandler bonds, because it's a sure thing that those interest earnings will get paid. So typically it's folks that are closer to retirement or pension funds that are looking for a very stable investment that look for AAA bond rated bonds. They're very, very easy to sell on the open market. And typically the delta between a AA and a AAA on the market is quite a few basis points, depending on what's happening in the economy at that period of time. So it's hard to quantify it, but I can tell you, typically you will get a much lower rate of return than a AA when you're selling bonds on the open market.
And the ability to sell those, I guess, is important, as I think I heard you say that earlier. You may have a AA bond rating, you may give higher interest rates, but if an economy is not doing well, or you could put your money to another area, you may not be able to sell some of those bonds because the risk.
Yeah, through the mayor, Councilmember Orlando, that is absolutely correct. There's some cities that actually hire underwriters that market their bonds and help them to really garner buyers for the bonds. When we put a Chandler bond out for open bid, we get a lot of bids and it's very competitive. We typically don't have to go that extra mile with a AAA bond rating.
Okay, thank you. Thanks,
You're
Mayor.
very welcome. Okay, so in order for the city to sell bonds, the voters must approve how much we can sell ahead of time, referred to as, of course, the voter authorization, and it's literally looked at as a credit limit. There are different types of bonds the city can issue. The most common is our general obligation bonds, but there's also excise tax revenue obligations, and revenue bonds are the other two that the City of Chandler has done in the past. Based on Arizona revised statute, cities must have voter authorization for general obligations, but ETROs, or the excise tax revenue obligations, and revenue bonds may be sold without authorization for essential infrastructure. But it really depends on the bond counsel who provides the interpretation of the statute. So that can vary. Our bond counsel in Chandler allows excise tax revenue obligations to be sold without bond authorization. So although we no longer have water and wastewater authorization, we have sold ETROs over the past few years to continue doing utility projects. Without that, we would have not been able to do any additional projects in that category. ETROs are actually backed by excise taxes or transaction privilege taxes. They're backed by that, but we actually, when we're selling them for water, wastewater infrastructure, we're paying that debt with the user fees instead. The hope would be that we would obtain voter authorization to ensure critical areas do not need to rely on this practice. When we project needs for our future and ask voters to approve future bond sales, the projections can be made to only include projects that will fit within our assessed value projections, thereby not requiring a tax increase, or if a significant infrastructure need is identified that needs to be completed immediately, we can calculate that projected tax impact as well. We can also balance debt by adjusting payment schedules to increase or decrease by year based on other debt maturing. And we do that all the time to try to really match our how much we're getting in on our levy to pay our debt service. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a moment. So projects can be pushed out or timed in different ways also to avoid any change in the tax rate. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can balance that out. Each time we go to the voters, we need to determine how many years of authorization we're asking for. And that's something that I think is yet to be determined in this process. The city of Chandler's been out to the voters 10 times since 1985. The last time in 2007, and we're currently in the situation that we do not have enough authorization to support the 10-year plan that was adopted beginning July 1st. We currently have minimal authorization remaining in police and fire and none in water and wastewater. Since the bond authorization amounts are based on estimates, the actual cost of the project could result in remaining authorization in certain categories. The museum, public building, and solid waste categories are areas that were not used up for their intended purpose. After discussion with our bond counsel recently, we were told that the remaining museum authorization can shift up to park and rec. Although the others were written in such a way to not allow that flexibility. So not only will we not have enough authorization to support our current 10-year plan in certain areas, we also have other projects that we have not been able to incorporate in our 10-year plan that Marcia will discuss soon.
Dawn, a
Yes,
question.
Mayor.
So just for the public who might be watching this, it does seem that we have a fair amount of money in parks and in streets. But obviously, when we talk about parks, particularly streets, there's a lot more. So just comment on the balance of that, since we don't need to reauthorize as compared to need, please.
Absolutely, Mayor. So you are correct that the mayor, or both the park and rec category and the streets category are our largest areas of remaining authorization. Those are both areas that have quite a bit of need in our community. And we have already built in enough needs that, for instance, park and recreation, knowing that there's still needs that we didn't build in our 10-year plan, we will use up the $42.3 million based on the current projected projects within the next 7.5 years. So in the streets area, again, transportation plan was recently completed. There's still quite a few projects out there that we need to have probably some dialogue around in what might need to be incorporated in our 10-year plan. But this amount will get us through also a portion of the 10-year plan. I can't remember the exact year, but those are very expensive pieces of infrastructure, and it goes pretty quickly when we start selling for the large arterials in the streets.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Vice Mayor.
So as to that point, what is the caliber that those bonds in 2007 were? So we've consumed, 60, 70, 90% of that? Is that because when we go to streets and to parks, like you mentioned, it's intended for a large projects. So even though it does on a line item seem like a lot,
Mm-hmm.
again, bearing in mind it's it's intended to cover 10, 12 years. It's intended to cover many projects. So how much does that 45 million and some million really reflect of the overall initial bond approval?
Through the mayor, Vice Mayor Lopez, I'm not quite sure what percentage of it is remaining here. There's actually some of what's on this list that was from prior bond elections before 2007. Like I talked about, some of those areas that were not completely used for their intended purpose. So we have used a pretty significant portion of the 2007 authorization, but it was during that time when the projections were being done for the bond committee, it was being looked at towards build out for the city of Chandler. And so there was a lot of projects that were contemplated in the future that we knew over time might change slightly, but it was a very long-term projection, and it was soon after that authorization was received, based on projections that our assessed values were going to go up, 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 that the recession hit, and our assessed values went down. So our focus at that point was really just maintaining our existing debt service and being able to pay the principal and interest on that, rather than adding new debt on top of it. But yes, large projects, a lot of analysis that went into that on what Chandler would need all the way through build out at that time.
If I may, second question then, so is this new bond election intended to take us to a new depicted bill out, or only to what we, like you mentioned before, just to finish out the 10-year SIP?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, that is part of the question that I would hope you would send to the Bond Exploratory
Okay.
Committee. And we'll get to that here in a little bit around
jumping
your
ahead.
question. No problem. Mayor, Council, I would also like to add, Dawn is absolutely correct in what she said about what's currently built into the CIP. What's not in the current CIP are a lot of community needs that you all are well aware of, and costs have gone up dramatically if you go back to 14 years ago when all of this was originally done. So these projects are costing more. But nonetheless, I just want to make sure that for the public's sake, there's a complete understanding that just because this might carry us 7 years on our current CIP, there are many needs out there that are not in that CIP. So just want to make sure that that's clear.
All right, thank you, Mayor. So one reminder is the last bullet on this slide, that authorization is not new debt, nor does it raise the tax rate. It simply authorizes the city to sell bonds for projects in those categories. An important point there. Okay, so as I mentioned, selling bonds does not automatically translate to a tax increase. This chart shows the history of the bond sales back to fiscal year 2007-8 to today. The red line represents the assessed value, and the gray line represents the secondary property tax rate. As values go up, council has reduced the rate, and as values go down, council has increased the rate. This is to ensure that we're consistently collecting a level of tax levy that can pay the principal and interest on our outstanding bonds, but not necessarily to increase taxes to add additional projects. You'll notice the general obligation bond sales are also plotted on this. As you can see, there are general obligation bond sales in fiscal year 11-12, and then not again until fiscal year 17-18. This was because, like we just talked about, those assessed values had gone down so much during the recession that the tax rate had to come up enough to be able to pay our existing debt, but adding new debt would have resulted in a tax increase. Council made the decision to not increase taxes, although the flip side is that our CIP was also very limited. Additionally, the Arizona Revised Statute sets a formula that calculates our statutory debt limit. The city of Chandler has only used 25% of our statutory debt limit, which is much lower than many of the communities around us, except the neighboring town. I found out today they're very close to that as well. The town. Okay, so our CIP is funded with various types of revenues. The bonds are the highest, actually funding 52% of the projects in our capital plan, with the next highest being cash balances at 27%, then grants, system development fees or impact fees, highway user fees, and local transportation assistance fees making up the remaining 21%. This really shows the impact that bonds can have on our ability to add new and maintain existing infrastructure. This chart shows the current 10-year plan by each of those funding sources from the prior slide, with all the revenues supporting a $1.16 billion CIP. As I discussed earlier, we do not have enough authorization to support our current 10-year plan, as shown in that little orange section of the chart, But there's more discussion around this, and I'll turn it over to Marcia now to discuss the other capital needs that exist outside the 10-year plan. Thank you.
So, Mayor, Council, as I mentioned a while ago, we do have a lot of needs. As you are well aware, we have a number of plans, such as the Master Transportation Plan that was just approved. Going back to the question regarding what is remaining in appropriation or authorization there, we've been extremely fortunate here in Chandler to have received, I think the number was over $300 million in grants over the course of the last number of years through the state or federal dollars, and some of it regional sales tax dollars, to have completed a number, especially of our arterial street widening projects. But as you may recall from January, that transportation plan has millions of dollars in needs, and the community had reviewed a lot of that, and then it was brought through your Transportation Commission to you in terms of a recommendation. There's some short-range ones in there that need to be looked at as well. Currently, we have out the Parks Master Plan. We just had our second round of community input on that. What is remaining in authorization there, I'm not even positive would complete Mesquite Groves Park development, much less anything else beyond that that you would want to do over the course of the next several years, or possibly do, or that the community might want. Over in addition to what even staff or council may be aware of as we get into this. In areas for water, wastewater, and all of those that Don talked about, yes, we've been doing this without actual bond authorization. However, there are continuous needs as our treatment facilities age, as our piping infrastructure ages, as all of the wells that we have in the ground are aging. All of these things, we're going to have to continue to keep those up for the community. So there are needs. I could go through every one of these. Facilities, we just finished our first phase of looking at all of the city facilities, and keeping in mind we have 60, 70 facilities out there. And I think the first phase was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $64 million in needs. This CIP will not ever support that. Again, you have to go back to priorities on those, and those will be discussed if council moves forward with the exploratory committee on which ones are important that might need to require some bonding capacity for. So anyway, there are needs across the organization, both community and internal, to sustain the community as we go forward. So just kind of wanted to walk through a few of those for you all, and I'll turn it back over to Don. Oh, no, we're done. Don's done. All right. So I don't know if you have any questions. We can stop there, see if there's a question before we move into the next piece of this.
Vice Mayor.
So just to get some clarity, because on SIP, construction in progress, is that what SIP stands for? Yeah.
Oh, CIP, it's Capital Improvement Program.
Capital improvement? Okay, all right. So we're able to use bond money. We don't have any restrictions, or is there any limitations when we say we have bond money? Because again, we talked about, construction, we talked about new, and we talked about maintenance. So we are allowed to utilize bond money for ongoing maintenance of roads or parks or other things like that.
Yes, Vice Mayor, why don't you talk about how y'all look at that as we get into the budget?
Through the mayor, Vice Mayor Lopez, when we're looking at what can be funded with bond proceeds, typically it's major maintenance that actually extends the useful life of an asset. So we really have to make sure that any of the items going into the capital plan that are coded to the bond funds meet that criteria, as well as match it to the language, because typically even the bond language will say new facilities, maintaining facilities. It will add that as part of the language too.
I just wanted to make sure that we, again, through our own process and procedures, right, we do not fund ongoing maintenance or reoccurring expenses with single point one-time gains, right, or revenues. So I just wanted to clarify, yeah, if it's an upgrade to a facility, like you said, a major change, a one-time, again, project, I can see that, but I just wanted to clarify whether that was, again, a reoccurring or ongoing maintenance activities.
Through the mayor, Vice Mayor Lopez, if it's going in the bond fund, it's going to be a larger one-time costs that will extend the useful life. We do have programs in the CIP, but typically they're not funded with bonds that are more of that ongoing upkeep of our assets.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Councilmember Wong, then Councilmember Orlando.
You may already answer this before, but, oh,
There
sorry.
you go.
You may answer this before, but I just like to ask, okay, again. So how much is our existing bond? How much do we owe right now? The, the existing bond we already been issued. It's there?
Yeah, it's already in there. This is the amount.
Oh, this is what have been authorized, but
Oh,
we,
yeah, okay.
we may not already sell it. Yeah. My question
I
is,
understand.
yeah, my question is how much we already sold.
Through the mayor, Councilmember Wong, it's less than 300 million
300 million, okay.
outstanding
And
bonds.
so how much interest are we paying every year? Do you have the number?
I don't have that number in front of me, but I can get that for you.
Sure, definitely. The reason I'm asking that is, well, this a little bit philosophical argument is for personal finance. Well, if you don't have the money, you don't spend. And of course, for the government, for the city, that could be a different idea because we do have some certain needs that we do need to spend it, regardless we have money or not, in order to keep the function and operation of the city. But since we are in AAA bonding, since our financial situation has been pretty well, why is that really necessary? We need to sell bonds. And of course, we can argue that, there's some, because we have CIP needs, we have 10 years CIP, and that require, we don't have enough money for that. So we need to sell bonds. But on the other hand, can we cut a few CIP items so we don't need to issue bonds? It's no matter what, you sell bonds, you got to pay the interest and you got to pay it back.
Yes.
And so that will be added on the burden. So my personal finance philosophy is I don't like to owe any debt. Of course, city do have debt. And for example, I have a few houses. All my house has no mortgage. Okay, and you can say most people don't do it that way, but I found out this is probably more financially feasible for me. I just don't owe debt unless that's really necessary. I did see people buying cars, finance the car, finance the house, finance the sofa, finance almost everything. And it ends up their paycheck almost every month, 30% of their paycheck is gone at the first day. And for me, my paycheck every month, except the tax paid for the government, it's all stay. So, and I understand you just mentioned about the philosophy why issuing bond is a good idea. So would you mind maybe say it again, and so I can get some kind of education? Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Through the mayor, Councilmember Huang, I did mention having some debt is healthy. And that goes hand in hand with a strong debt management plan for the city. We have very strong debt management policies. We have guidelines around the type of projects we could sell bonds for. We do it very wisely. But it is necessary because it does allow us to be really graded by external parties to determine our credit worthiness. And that goes a long way when you have, like I mentioned earlier, need to build a wastewater treatment plant, for instance, and it's a $200 million plant. There is no amount of time that you can wait to get enough money to build a necessary piece of infrastructure like that. It is important that you have the ability or the power, I guess, to sell bonds to be able to fund this necessary infrastructure that really leads to the safety, the public safety of citizens. Water plants, wastewater plants, many of our public safety facilities, they're not, it would be difficult to save dollars because we are a very lean city, fast enough to build the infrastructure that's required for our citizens. So it is important to have the ability to sell bonds and to have some debt, to be rated, and I'm not quite sure what else to say. So it is a healthy thing to do that. As long as you have the framework and the policies in place that you're making wise decisions and you're not selling bonds for things that have a 5-year life and selling 20-year bonds. You're going to want to sell for things that the useful life is much greater than the amount of time it's taking you to pay them back.
Yes.
Does that help?
So this is definitely a sophisticated process. And just like you say, water treatment, all those things are very essential service the city should provide. And we definitely need to do it. If we don't have money, we should borrow it. But I just want to remind everybody, you borrow any money, you need to pay it back. And how if 2 years later we have something need, 3 years later we have something need, and I guarantee you we will always have something in need. So if our interest is pretty, if we need to pay a lot of interest, and if we owe a lot of money, and if the economy just down, that means we are going to cut the staff, we are going to cut a lot of service. Will that cause a problem and then eventually become bankrupt? I'm not saying we will be bankrupt. I have full confidence of us. But city bankrupting did happen everywhere. Yeah, so.
So Councilmember, one of the things that, because I have a very similar philosophy that you do, I don't have any debt personally, but the types of things that we're talking about in terms of building, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dawn, is that part of a philosophy of running a city is that the people who will use these items will be paying for them in the future. So a water treatment plant is good for 20+ years, for example, and 20 years from now, those people who are utilizing those will be paying the secondary tax as opposed to us paying it now and going there. So a lot of the large items are really the use of them are for people that aren't even here. And then they will also be paying into those as part of this. So that was part of when I first came on council, that was different for me because I also thought, well, we should run, never go into debt. But I realize it's different with a city than our own personal finances.
Sure, yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Councilmember Orlando, then Councilmember McClemens.
Thank you, Mayor. So a couple of things. Ironically, Councilmember Wong, we sold about $10 million worth of bonds during the recession because we needed to do something at that time. We didn't lay anyone off, and we had a pretty much a business as usual philosophy. We sell bonds all the time. I mean, you just heard us say we sell the ETRO bonds. We sold those. How many of those we sold in the last 10 years, 15 years? Roughly, I don't know, a bunch, right?
Quite a bit.
Yeah, quite a bit. That's my point. So it's nothing new. We're doing this. We've also done, one of the things we keep short-changing ourselves on is the robust fiscal policies we put in place, and this council has shared. We saved a lot of one-time money. And we probably don't, and I don't want to challenge on this because it's probably a lot of money, but how many of these projects we paid with one-time dollars? I mean, this facility was built with one-time dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Street projects outside were built with one-time dollars. So we have been, go back to your concerns, we have been fiscally prudent, and we've used one-time dollars when we can. We've floated bonds when we can. And we were diligent of when we did pull the trigger to be able to sell those bonds. The other thing we have to look at is we've also refinanced bonds, which saves the taxpayer dollars, millions of dollars. So when we go to the taxpayers and say, look, you've entrusted us over the last 20 years with the last bond election, almost, was it 12 years ago? I can't remember, 2007, 13 years ago. You've entrusted us to use your money in a fiscal, prudent manner. Yet we still build things. We still have roads that are running. Mayor kidded a couple of weeks ago or months ago about some of the potholes he's seen in some of the other cities. You know, we're taking care of the business here. It's an investment in our community. So when we ask a bondholder to buy our bonds, they're comfortable enough to say, you know what? I want to invest in Chandler. So I'm going to buy their bonds so that they could move forward in the right venue. So, you know, let's see, this is a time versus money. And I look to my, to you, this is time versus money. I could wait 5 years, 8 years to build something, build that money up, or I could turn around and say, hey, look, I'm going to go finance it now at a much lower rate than many, many cities could possibly do, and we'll pay it back. And if the rates go down, guess what? We'll refinance those bonds. So we got to look at both sides of this ledger, I guess what I'm trying to say. We've done a lot of good things in this city, and we could, all of us on this dais could proudly hang our hats and say, we did the right things at the right time for the right reasons. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilmember McClymons, then Councilmember Rowe.
So I just want to piggyback a little bit on what Councilmember Orlando said. You know, we provide some of the best services in Arizona for a city at the lowest cost. I think we're at the lowest cost. But there's certain critical things that we need to deliver to provide the best quality of life. And if we do the SAVE model, that might happen in 10 years versus we can make an impact now and today. But one of the important points that Councilmember Orlando was alluding to was the interest rate environment we're in is an extraordinary opportunity. If Don wants to elaborate a little bit on the interest rate environment of the last bond, wasn't it under 2 or right at 2?
Through the mayor, Councilmember McClymons, I think it ended up at 1.96%.
That's almost free. And so, I mean, it's a good opportunity to be careful and calculated on what we need. We definitely do not need to borrow, and we need to be calculated on what we do borrow, but it is a good opportunity to borrow so we can provide the best quality of life for our residents. So.
All right, keep going.
All right. Mayor and Council, just to add to the conversation that you're having, you also have to keep in mind, and for the public to also be thinking about, as you know, we as a city are trying to always move the city forward, and we have a lot of companies that look for us, look to us. Do they want to locate here? Do they want to do those kind of things? And some of the first questions we get is, what kind of infrastructure can you provide for us? And what is the quality of life things that are out there? And I know y'all are so focused on all of that, which is great. But when it comes to these sort of things and to the question about build now or save and do later, if we don't have that infrastructure already built, we're going to lose out on future economic development and those sort of things, because those are the things that companies look to, and those are the things that provide the job that keep this community moving forward. So it is definitely a need to make sure that we have good quality infrastructure and quality of life things out there that continues to draw from an economic development standpoint as well. I just wanted to add that to your conversation. With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure. And I know I had visited with Mayor and each of you briefly, individually, about a possible committee structure, but definitely wanted to put this up on the screen and kind of talk through how this might operate. And I think the mayor wants to get some complete buy-in from the council around this. So for the Bond Exploratory Committee, I think it's just imperative that you have a lot of the community that can get involved in this process. Hopefully you will get a lot of buy-in to the process. And then when it comes time for that vote, there's a lot of people that already know exactly what you're going to be doing and will be happy to cast that yes vote. So with the overarching committee, or the Bond Exploratory Committee, I'll call them the core group or steering committee, what do you want to call them, would be made up, at least proposed here, of the chair and 6 members. That number is not magic. It can go up or down, or whatever council wants to look at for that. And then the idea here would be that one of these members would then chair a subcommittee, and that takes you down to those 7 different areas. And then additional 6 members on each of those subcommittees, again, that could provide input, and staff can provide all of the information necessary and the facts around projects and things like that. I would also assume, again, this would be council direction here in a minute, about if you want these subcommittees to really look at some public involvement a part of that or not. But anyway, so that is the thought process, at least, behind what's proposed here for the committee structure. And Mayor, I'll hand it back to you to see how your council and you want to move forward with the actual structure.
Thank you, City Manager. I know in the past, I think we've just had a bond central committee, and they've done some public output. Councilmember Orlando was on council the last time we did this. Boy, I'm not sure I like the look of wearing this thing, I'll be honest with you, but I'm able to talk a little freer, and so I'll keep with it tonight. But this allows, with this structure, it allows 49 people as opposed to a handful who have been on there in the past. And many of you, in fact, all of you, have submitted suggestions, and I'm committed to make sure that at least some of your suggestions will be represented. Some of you listed more than others, and to me, that's a good basis. We've also gone out. I've asked the chamber, President Terry Kimball, about a month ago. We've talked to others in the community. We've talked to our subcommittee, our boards and commissions folks, and so we've got a healthy list of people to choose from that are great Chandler residents, and many have been involved. I think there's others that perhaps this will be their first time to engage in the city. Little known fact is that my first participation in Chandler government was to serve on a charter revision committee back in the early 90s, I think. And it was a good experience for me, very well professionally led by staff. And Patrice Krause was, I think, the liaison at that time. And I felt it was a good mentoring experience for a young Chandler resident, or I should say younger Chandler resident, to get involved. So I hope that the committee is, if you're good with this structure, that we'll draw a mix of some sage, experienced people, some opportunities for some who have not been, this might be some of their early opportunities to get involved, and maybe they'll be on this day sometime in the future. But in all cases, they'll be the voice of this bond and the voice of that'll direct some of their passions if council is good with this, and to be able to move ahead. Could the number be higher? Yes. Could the number be lower? Yes, but I think you get too big, and then you're going to have a harder time making quorum and finding this. If you get lower, then you're going to reduce your input. So to me, this seemed like a healthy amount of people. So, Councilmember Stewart, did you want to say something?
Thank you, Mayor. I didn't want to interrupt you, though, but as it relates to the committee, thank you for the opportunity to include leaders within the community on those lists. The one thing, like, it all happened pretty quickly. The one thing I was curious, we're talking about inclusion, then we're talking about making sure that everything is moving forward where we can get younger, possibly, students, and maybe not as members, but per se, but as I don't know what the term would be called for that, but you have the We the People group at Hamilton, you have all these other student government organizations to get them involved so we can listen to what the future thinks could be great for Chandler as it relates to these committees, for each one of these subcommittees. That's one thing that I wanted to ask. And then I also want to be clear that a bond committee doesn't mean necessarily that we're raising taxes. It means that we are going to maybe continue in the same thread that we're in right now. We just have to continue to vote on that, and otherwise it just dies and it falls off the ledger, and then we don't build roads, and then we don't or if we do, we have to do it with one-time dollars. Is that true? Or maybe that's for you, Don.
I could make a comment perhaps more. Is it, one of the other questions I was going to ask you all is how much input do we want to give this committee? And my recommendation would be honestly is let them organically grow this. It's going to come back to us rather than say, this is the amount of money that we think you should allocate. I think there's going to be some great voices in the community, and ultimately it will come back to a council who will approve this for a bond. So but I agree with you on your first point, and I think the second point, my goal would be to, as we look at this now, would be to keep our secondary tax the same, depending on the level of need and represented here. I think that's my starting point, and as we see where our need is in Chandler, we'll have a chance to review that question before it goes further. But there's the amount, and then there's the timing that also dictate the property tax, so that it's not just an amount equals. As we saw previously, there's a number of these items that still haven't been, that they haven't come into fruition. So there's several variables that will determine what decisions we'll be making, and we are future councils to determine the impact on secondary property tax with this.
Mayor.
We're just authorizing the possibilities, and then when they make sense, us or future councils will have the opportunity to meet with our staff, current or future, to determine is that a proper need and a proper expense at that time.
Got
Did I answer your question before I go into?
Oh, absolutely.
Great.
Thank you, Mayor.
Councilmember Orlando, then Vice Mayor.
Mayor, good piggyback. So the way I look at this, Mayor, first of all, I'm okay with the structure. Looks about balanced, and I think you're right. Let's get some sage advice in there. Let's get some newer residents, whatever we want to do, a mix, so that we do represent the community as best we could. Because you're right, this is a recommendation coming back to us and the citizens of Chandler eventually. I look at this as like any other committee, the Planning and Zoning Committee, the CDBG Committee, the Parks, P&Z, we appoint them. They go do their jobs, their roles. They come back with their recommendations to us. Airport Commission, they come back with their recommendation to us. We accept them, we modify them. This is nothing different. So I don't think this is anything revolutionary here. This is pretty good. But I do want to say one other thing here, Mayor. Traditionally, this committee normally turns into the bond pro committee once they come to a resolution. Is that the same philosophy here?
In terms of, I'd say the central, all of that, I would say yes, in the sense that these are the people that ultimately are going to be our voices and flag bearers. But the end committee, there's obviously will be a group that will helping us the campaign of selling this and ongoing advice. Maybe not everybody, but yes.
Okay, so that's my point. So we're pretty much same structure that a
Sure.
lot of bond committees do.
I don't
Okay.
envision, again, based upon Pastor, that a separate group that's going
Correct.
to be mobilizing this as opposed to those recommending this.
Right, because the ones that recommend it have the details and the knowledge of what they're trying to do to be able to explain to the public what we're trying to do. So it'll be really a disadvantage for somebody else to just come in and say, I'll run this for you without some of the details, backgrounds. Because again, that does come up, as you know, is how'd you come up with 42 million for this? How'd you come up with 13 million for that? And those are all part of the communication strategy. It's okay. Thank you, Mayor.
Good point. Vice Mayor.
So, twofold, the structure, again, I'm also all good with, would we also be assigning those subcommittees, or would that be something decided within the main committee? Because again, part of this also is we want to make sure that we do have people as part of those subcommittees. Talk about most recently IT, that we do have people in there extremely knowledgeable, understanding, what a fiber network is versus, a wireless and so on and so forth. So is that also the intent that we would assign those subcommittee heads also?
So, yes, and
Okay.
a little later on in this presentation is a
Oh,
timeline
we're done.
that
Oh,
also
sorry.
talks about dates and
Okay.
so we've been working staff has been looking at people who can lead those. Certainly, we would want IT, for example, of people who are knowledgeable in that and are able to ask the right questions and understand that. And so, yes, I think
Okay.
that's the answer.
And my second one is similar to what Councilmember Stewart said about the tax rate. I believe we need to have that flexibility. However, end goal vision in mind, again, I would hope, again, we are targeting to not, again, raise any taxes with this, whether it be continuation of the current bond debts that we have, and or we've even paid some off earlier and so on, but we do need to have that with end goal in mind of that. Again, knowing to that, depending upon what the bond committee does find, we may need to flex, but I think that's a good way to target. Thank
And I
you.
would also say that really after all of us are no longer on this days, there's going to be those that are going to be asking questions of the needs of our community, and this will give them the ability to do some things that are essential and necessary, and they'll be wrestling with the same questions.
Mayor,
I mean, Councilmember McClymans, and then back to you, Councilmember.
Thank you, Mayor. First on the structure, when we first started discussing this, I love the structure because we're definitely going to get good and great and deep feedback from the community at large in different areas and different passions. But I definitely, to echo what Vice Mayor Lopez, I would challenge this committee to balance our needs and then our wants, prioritize with the end goal to stay tax neutral. And so that's where I stand, but I'm excited about what we have ahead.
so
Councilmember Lane.
I'm hearing something totally different than we've done in the past. I'm just curious what we're trying to say here. Usually, again, you go to the bond committee, you say, look at the needs, look at the priorities, but they never come back to us and say, oh, by the way, cut this line because it may raise taxes. I don't know what the assessed value is going to be 2 years from now. So how could I put that burden on them? I guess I'm asking, how do I put that burden on them?
So my answer would be, I would not want to put that burden on
Okay.
them, because ultimately, whatever list that they come up with, we and
We're
future
responsible.
council members are the ones that will be determining the secondary tax as well as the need to
Okay.
improve that. So I share the philosophy, but I also would not want to, I wouldn't want to put that. There might be a time that we might be able to lower this or keep it neutral, or depending on things, there might be a need to raise that. But
Yeah.
I think we're being responsible in looking at the needs and wanting to be able to fund them for the future.
And,
But
okay,
I have to trust future councils, just as previous councils are trusting us to do the right thing for our community.
okay, thanks for the clarification, because that's really what we're trying to say, not saying here. We're trying to say is, go out, justify the need for the bond, or whatever the project is. Do I need a new police lab, or do I don't need a new police lab? Or is it 50 million too much, or should be 25 million? Come back to this council, we roll that in, and then we go out and we go to the voters. And then we, as the council, this one or the next one or 10 years from now, will say, no, we're not going to build the police station or the lab now. We'll do it some other time, or we will piece of it now, piece of it later, based upon current economic conditions. That's correct? Okay. All right. Make sure I appreciate
Right,
that.
so I'm hearing 5 people say I'm in favor of this structure. I think I'll give Councilmember Stewart a yes, thumbs up on favor with his comments. Councilmember Wong.
I thought the need we have is to fulfill the 10-year CIP plan. It's already been regulated. It's not that these bond committees are going to decide new items or are going to remove items for us. Right? Is this a fair statement?
Yes and no. And yes, in the sense that this year is the only year that we've appropriated money. And there have been items in the past that were designated for year 4 that maybe got moved up to year 2 or back to year 8, or they were determined that they weren't a need. We've had different items that fell off and different items that have come on our 10-year CIP plan. But that's the best that we look at in terms of planning the future, realizing that every year our priorities might change a little bit.
Okay.
So you're for this?
Yeah.
All right. Councilmember Rowe.
Thank you, Mayor. I heard tax or revenue neutral, and for this body today, right now, I think that's what we want. And will there be a group in the future that wants something different? That will be up to them. But I've told the public over and over again that that is the way I feel. And that should be an important part of this discussion. And I'm not in favor of pie in the sky projects. And I hope we will come back with very reasonable stuff, because guess what? Bonding can occur again and again and again and again. So we don't have to go too crazy on it, and we can be reasonable. And I think we've done that in the past. Seeing as it was 2007 since the last bonding. So I think our debt service is less than 10% of our budget. Is that close? Yeah, so that shows good restraint. Chandler has great finance. I'm in favor of this. I think it's a good path forward. I want to see partnerships, and I don't know how you draw that into this stuff, but if we want a crime lab, that's fine. Gilbert wants one too. And so does every other police agency in the state of Arizona. And so I want people to come back to us and say, here's a partnership, let's bond, let's use money, our money with their money, and let's get it done for the people. So I'm in favor of it, yes.
Councilmember Orlando.
So I guess I'm hearing what you're saying. Again, we relied on impact fees to build a lot of the infrastructure in Chandler. Those impact fees are gone, or basically gone. I mean, we're nowhere near the impact fees that we did. When I say when I'm gone, I mean they're still on the books, Councilmember Stewart. We're just not getting enough in there. So we built a lot of infrastructure on impact fees. I'm just, because you looked over at Dawn, I thought maybe you're, I'm just teasing you, buddy, teasing you. We don't have that revenue stream like we had in the past. So my point is, when you do this bond election, to sit here and say revenue neutral, yes, this year's budget was revenue neutral. Next year's budget, your assessed value may go up, and you may want to add a project to it and not affect your bond rating, revenue neutral. The year after, your assessed value may go down, and you may say, I'm going to push back, I'm not going to sell this bond this year. So again, I don't think I'm still trying to struggle what I'm hearing about revenue neutral and bonding, and it is two different discussions. It's give an example. I go to the bank and I want $100,000 credit line. Okay, it's been approved. Now whether I use that $100,000 this year or next year or next week, that's a different decision matrix, right? I could use 10,000 now, I could use none of it. That's all we're asking here, is give us the obligation to do this. Whether we do it or not, that's a totally different story.
So we'll have that discussion.
Okay.
When that time comes. But I'm hearing yes, let's proceed with this. And at this point, the only person that has been appointed here is I did ask someone to serve as our chair. This person is one of our former mayors who was mayor during the last bond, and I'd like to invite him up to share a couple things. Commissioner Dunn, you'd like to say hello and say anything about this bond, et cetera?
Mayor, I thought you were going to have Jim Patterson do this.
Sure.
Hello, on the ordinance to take off my mask for a second. Thank you. I like the style, Mayor. Thank you very much. I've been listening very intently with discussion and been taking a lot of notes. I understand your concerns, and it's an honor to be asked to be the chairman of the main committee and perhaps even a chairman for the finance subcommittee, which would be very beneficial. We've been through this effort before. Councilman Rolando is correct. Our impact fees have gone away. That's a significant revenue stream that we've used in the past for infrastructure. So we need to just concentrate on what we need in the future, those needs that are critical, that our citizens want to have in the city, and be able to at least allow that authorization to be there for future councils to use, and be able to build that infrastructure sooner and later than later. Because that's our reputation as a city. We've done our infrastructure early and when it's necessary. So we have our roads in, our parks in pretty much. And I think the citizens appreciate that. They can come here, they can live here and be able to enjoy that infrastructure and those amenities right away. So I will work hard. I will listen to council. I appreciate your input. I think we have an excellent staff to work with. And I'm anxious to put that time in. So thank you very much for the honor.
And we'll see former Mayor Dunn several times over the process of the next months and as we actually go into the next year. So I look forward to this familiar face being part of our meeting. So,
Mayor.
Councilmember Orlando.
And Mayor, Boyd, thank you very much for volunteering. Certainly appreciate it. And, you know, this guy here is the guy that championed the impact fees many, many years ago. If it wasn't for this guy championing it, remember some of those home builders coming to us and threatening us and everything else, and we stuck to it, right? And
Well,
we
thank
set
you.
the trend for this city and the rest of this state.
For
So
some of the
thank
battles
you.
we had on impact fees, for example, that kind of ruffled some feathers out there. But I think we set a standard really that other cities have followed. So we have a lot of history. A lot of councils have been on that. So I have about 3 or 4 months of my current responsibility, but after that I'll have a lot more free time. So
Sorry about
I'm anxious to work at the local level again. I miss it greatly. So thank you for that honor again and privilege.
Commissioner Dunn, I also want to thank you for your work on the Corporation Commission and your assistance to Chandler residents and all across the state. So thank you.
Well, we have some significant items to decide this month, one being a new energy plan and hopefully clean energy policy. So I think that will help with economic growth and jobs coming to Chandler especially. So we'll be working hard on that. But thank you.
Thank you. All right, City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. So sounds like we're good on the structure. Next, just want to talk a little bit about some of the phases that we'll have to go through as we get through this process. These are probably not big surprises, but just mainly for those that might not be familiar. So first phase, obviously, once council establishes the ordinance, that will establish the Bond Exploratory Committee, and then following that with your appointed membership, we would kick off with some committee education and expectation setting, work diligently with your chair so he can establish all of those things as we move into this. The next phase would be to start those subcommittee meetings and start looking at cost estimates and engaging public support for any projects. And then obviously those subcommittees would bring back prioritized recommendations to the overarching committee. The next phase would be just that the subcommittee would present and discuss their findings with the overall committee. After that, the committee would review and discuss and obtain and work on the financial analysis of any of those recommended projects in order to put together a package, or maybe the package and an alternative package, however that works out, with the committee, and bring back those projects through final recommendations, including possible alternatives, as I mentioned, for council consideration. And then the committee chair would end up presenting that final report and recommendations to the mayor and council in the future. Flip that. With that, we've already had the discussion on the committee structure, and I've heard some discussion, Mayor, around any specific direction or maybe just handing this off to the committee. I don't know if you have anything else for that. The other thing that would like some mayor and council buy-in would be around a timeline for that final report. So there we can create the calendar for the committee and work with the chair on how we can make sure that we meet mayor and council's timeline to bring this back to you. So those are that's the last of the questions for today. And then we'll talk a little bit about an estimated calendar once you have that conversation.
So let me start the conversation on the second question. um, it's obvious that we will have an election and at least one new council member who will be part of this council. And it would be my recommendation to have the new council, who is actually going to have to drive this, be the final authorization. So that would mean that, in my mind, the timeline would be after we swear in a new council. Hopefully, obviously, most of us will be here, but it's extremely important that we get some strong buy-in and participation from the new council or the existing council at the time when this is going to have to be driven. So that's my thought on that. Does anyone have a divergent thought on that piece? Councilmember Wong.
So last time we done this, so yeah, it's all. Last time we have done this was what will be the timeline? It's in your idea. It looks like it would take maybe a year to finish the whole thing.
So very good question. Pending council approval and are moving forward now, there's a certain time in which you can run bond elections. And we would be looking at November of 2021 election. So it'll be what, 16 months from now.
Okay. That sounds pretty reasonable for your suggestion. Yeah.
Any other thought on that question before we go to the other? Councilmember Orlando.
So, Mayor, I had a conversation today with Kelly, our city attorney, and Kelly, so did we decide, as a charter city, do we have the flexibility of calling a different date in November?
If I may, Mayor, Councilmember Orlando, the statute on general obligation bonds requires the election to be held in November, on the consolidated election date in November. There has been case law interpreting those specific dictates of election times to charter cities, and there is some autonomy with charter cities. However, our charter is silent as to when we would hold a bond election. So in consulting with the bond council as well, we think you're probably required to hold the election in November.
Okay, so as of this date, November, if something should change or further discussion, we could discuss that at a later date.
Correct.
Which would be more important that the new council would be able to exercise that judgment. Okay, thank you.
Vice Mayor and then Councilmember Wong.
So talking about the timeline, I would agree. I mean, we'd want, hopefully, again, it's the vast majority of the council still here, but I'm good, and there would be one new council member no matter what. But I would think that we'd want phase 5, which is the first cut to the council for presentation and feedback before final 6, right? Is that the slide I recall?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, yes, we can make happen whatever the council would like.
So I would think that, and the first time that we get feedback from the bond committee would be with the new council, so post January, February, so that, again, that feedback as a whole council could be going back with any changes, and then for a final review by the committee. But also, we also want to be responsible in the, again, timing wise, and I know it's probably going to affect where we do start up, but again, we don't want to have a bond committee that's lingering out there for 12 months either. So we just want to be considerate of our citizenry, also those that are volunteering. So.
Okay. Councilmember Wong.
So I think until next council to be sworn on office, we still have about we still have 5 months. So on our first early stage of the committee, probably we'll focus more on education and discussion. And about city attorney says we may have to have the election in November. My question is, next year there will be no major elections. So why don't we put it into? Is there any difficulty to put it into August election instead of November? I would think if this is so important, why don't we? It's 16 months is a pretty long time. Yeah.
Councilmember Orlando asked that question, and
Yeah.
I believe City Attorney had said that according to state statute, it's supposed to be in November. So that's why.
Okay, but can you find out if there's a way we can make it into November or even July? Yeah.
She can look
Mayor,
into that. So.
Yeah.
Mayor, council member, we are talking to bond council. There's something we'll talk to you probably in a different forum about.
All right. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. Are we in the Q&A portion of this? I've got quite a few. things I wanna get
No,
cleared up.
we're still,
All right, thank you.
it sounds like we're all good with that in terms of the final report from what I'm hearing. The other question that I had is any specific direction given to this group? And again, I'll start by sharing, I would be interested in hearing from our community, less restricted and less of us telling them what we want to see on this, because they're going to come back and we're going to approve it no matter at the end. And I'd love to hear the creativity and the ideas that would be coming to them. What thoughts do you all have?
Man.
Yes, and yes?
So yeah, I forgot to mention that in one of my other notes, but yeah, the public, I mean, to the committee on that, I mean, we definitely want to make sure there's as much possible public input as can be had. You know, depending upon how all this COVID stuff winds up going, we may be all via, you know, Zoom meetings and surveys online, but use of social media. But again, I think we need to implore all of our citizenry out there, and probably between now and then, we're going to be doing budget surveys also, as we build up for next year's budget already. Right, Don's looking forward to that already. So yeah, mingle that in with the bond committee. I agree with you, Mayor, that we want to get as much input from our citizenry so that we're not driving this bus. The citizens are. So thank you.
If I could, no further questions, I assume that's yes, and we can go on with that. We've got some timeline and then open questions after that. So why don't we catch these last few slides and then any questions you might have. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm not going to read all of this because this is simply an estimated calendar, but just to point out a couple of things. So it sounds like we will be working towards possibly an ordinance coming to you, your Monday meeting in August, to establish the committee and work with the mayor and everyone in terms of those appointments to the committee that then could be done on that Thursday with the final reading of your ordinance establishing the committee. Following that, we would look to work with the chair on the first meeting of the committee sometime late August. I've got the 20th there, but that's not in concrete. And then if you'll flip over, it sounds like we will be bringing back January, February timeframe, the final report. Just want to point out that at your June 5th meeting, that is when you would have to call for the election if it's going to be November the 2nd. And per the city attorney, and work with her and the city clerk and the committee to make sure that we have all options laid out for council in terms of when that actual election would possibly take place. And then we'll work and modify towards that. So just wanted to kind of cover that just to give you an idea. And with that, Mayor, that is it. We'll take questions. Thank you.
All right, let's start with Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. I've got a handful here. Can we go back to slide 5? Real quick. So on slide 5, we have $42 million of bond authorization for Parks and Rec. We have another 75 for streets, which I think we're going to be light on. Why hasn't that been used if the voters approved it? And why didn't we use the 42 million to improve Parks and Rec?
Through the mayor, Councilmember Stewart. Oops, let me turn on my mic. It has been being used over time. It really has to do with the decisions of the councils from year to year based on where our assessed values are and the desire to increase taxes or not. Typically, what's happened over the last few years is that as assessed values are increasing, not necessarily because of appreciation, but because of new property, We've been able to capture that additional capacity in our rate, and it allows us to complete additional projects on an annual basis. But really, if you were to use it sooner, again, based on that timing, if you were to issue those bonds sooner, it would kick in a tax increase. So it's really just depends on the timing of the projects and how quickly you're going to use your bond authorization when you're weighing it against a property tax increase or not. So we have been using it. It just, like I mentioned earlier, during the recession, the assessed values went down. We held off selling bonds for a period of time because had we taken the tax rate up too much, it would have added additional capacity to do projects during that time, but it would have caused a tax increase to our property owners. So we did not sell bonds during that period of time, and that was a decision of council.
Okay. So if I understand that correct, so in 2007, voters said, the bond committee went out to the voters and said, hey, we're going to bond for this, 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 and this. One of those things is parks, museum, and then it's somewhere along the way, whatever council, is a new council said, well, we're not raising taxes to build those ball fields or those soccer fields. Is that a fair assessment?
Yep, through the mayor, Councilmember Stewart, when that bond election went out, the projections were done on the basis that assessed values were going to go up an average of 4 to 6% a year.
Okay.
And what actually happened is they went down after the recession.
Okay.
So it completely changed the timing of those projects. Had assessed values gone up, it would have been used, probably we would have completed projects much faster. They would have been built into the capital plan. But like you said, councils, as we move through the years, councils made the decision that they did not want to put that extra burden with assessed values actually going down after the recession. They pulled back and decided to just maintain.
So to follow up then, if we have a robust committee and we've got the right guy running this for sure, but if they come back with these projects, and we're going to have to raise taxes to fulfill the bonds that we authorize, is that correct?
And through the
In
mayor,
many cases, I'm sorry, unless it's secondary.
yeah, through the mayor, Councilmember Stewart, it would be based on, we'd have to set ours, right now we have assessed value projections built into our 10-year plan. If there's priorities that come out of those discussions that differ from what's in our 10-year plan, it may require us to move something out. Like the mayor mentioned earlier, the first year is the only year that's adopted. When it comes to years 2 through 10, it's a matter of timing and when you want to get those projects done and what your highest priorities are. So it may be that through those discussions with the subcommittees, they find that there's some higher priorities and they recommend that these projects be done before the ones we currently have placed in our 10-year plan. But you're right, unless assessed values exceed our projections, it's going to very much limit the additional projects that can be added to the 10-year plan.
And that makes sense. Somebody had mentioned earlier about wants and needs, so thank you for that clarification. Real quick, just to be clear on impact fees. I heard we had more permits pulled this year than we did last year at the same time, and that was like in mid-May. So what's the number, what's the delta there? Or is that true? It doesn't seem like that would.
Yeah, through the mayor, Councilmember Stewart.
Just for clarification.
Just for
'cause Matt
clarification
was-
on impact fees and system development fees, all the comments tonight, absolutely, it's an incredibly powerful plan. It allows us to pay for projects that are growth-related projects where we have to have infrastructure in place to support the growth. Over the years, all of those projects have been identified in a plan we call the Land Use Assumption and Infrastructure Improvement Plan. All of those projects are almost completed. We're to the point now that we're on the last few projects of that plan, but many of the projects we've completed, those impact fees had not come in yet, so we sold bonds early in order to have that infrastructure in place. And now what we can do is continue to collect impact fees and pay ourselves back for the projects because we've been paying debt service through our secondary tax levy. So over time, we can continue to charge that through the permit counter. Those impact fees, we'll collect those. There's very few growth projects remaining that we can actually use those and pay directly towards those growth projects, but we can pay ourselves back now because we've incurred the debt service through our secondary tax levy. They really kind of foot the bill up front, and impact fees will pay us back over time. If that
Right.
makes sense?
So our impact fees flat? They were up a little bit and they're flat now, or they're down?
Impact fees have been, we've had a very strong year for development, and impact fees have actually been coming in higher.
Okay.
Over the last month, I think there's been a slight reduction, but I think the bigger message here is we do still have the ability to collect impact fees and pay ourselves back
Great.
over time.
So here's my big question, Mayor. And so we're in a slowdown. We're lucky. We have half the unemployment rate that the national average is. But we're talking about possibly, as we walk through this, maybe raising taxes. And it could be a year from now, it could be 2 years from now, it could be not at all. I just want to be conscious of the fact that we have fixed income folks that are already seeing increases in property values, that may have their mortgage paid off, as Sam was talking about, that are seeing increases in property taxes. We just voted in a $290 million bond for the schools, which is much needed. We're building a new high school, which is wonderful. Now we're talking about another bond when we're walking into a recession. So I'm hoping that we can balance this great interest rates, right? These are amazing interest rates, with this challenge that we're facing with economically. So when you asked if we want to give direction earlier, I maybe missed my opportunity. I think we want to be really conscious of the fact that this bond committee needs to be cost neutral as much as possible, just in light of all the things that are going on. We'll still all do the amazing things because we just said impact fees are there. So if we need something now, we might be able to do that. But we may need something 10 years from now, and we certainly want to have the bond authority to do that. Lastly, I don't want to see, if we tell our voter we're going to do something for them. I'm one of those voters before I got on council that I thought I was getting parks. And that didn't happen because the council at that time decided no taxes for parks, for fields. And now we're getting them done, which is great. I just want to make sure that we're mindful of that 5 years down the road, or whatever that may be. So that is what I will close with. Thank you, Mayor.
Sure. And again, we're looking at our time.
Yes, well, I'll
5:52.
be quick. I just want to reiterate that I want to challenge us to balance our needs and not justify needs, because those are really wants that you're justifying, and prioritize, and do so with the mindset of going for, and I get that it's future councils, from a tax neutral perspective. At least that's my position. And regardless of what we do, we didn't talk a lot about timing, but if we do shorten the time frame to a 5 to 7 year period, there's a higher likelihood that what the voter goes for and approves, we're going to deliver on, versus a long period of time and then projects like parks gets pushed out. And so I'd also want to reiterate that. That's all I have.
All I'll say is that was a good point, Councilmember
Thank you,
Clements,
thank you.
and I have nothing more to add. I've spoken my piece.
I have no further comment.
All right. Thank you all.
Mayor,
You weren't looking up when I
I
looked at you.
apologize, I was writing my notes.
Councilmember Orlando.
Just quickly, council members, when I said the impact fees, percentage of the budget has dramatically dropped since we implement them for two reasons. One, as Dawn indicated, there's no longer the growth projects available. But number two, we've also been scrutinized by the industry to reduce the amount of impact fees we could actually levy upon percentage-wise. So where we relied on impact fees to build a lot of this before, we don't have that in a gross revenue percentage of revenue. So that's what I was trying to share that with you. Thanks, Mayor.
All right. Thank you all. Council, it is 5:55. I think we can start right at 6 o'clock. Work session adjourned.